a book event with an author named Craig Shirley, who argued that the Republican primary campaign that year was when Reagan conservatives captured hold of their party, and a lecture about how the Panama Canal Treaty had repercussions on American politics that stretched to this day. Tonight's program was supposed to be bipartisan. Our Republican director, Bill Lacey, interviewing three men who helped make the unlikely presidential run of a little-known Georgia governor a very successful reality. But Bill is sick tonight, so I'm filling in. I'm not sure I can even pretend to be a Reagan Republican for 60 minutes, so instead I'll be what I really am, a historian and a political junkie who's always found the campaign of '76, the first one I actually followed myself, one of the most fascinating of American history. Joining us tonight for our discussion is our spring 2009 Democratic fellow, Scott Burnett, who served as director of the Presidential Speakers Bureau during Carter's time in the White House and worked for then-Governor Carter's campaign beginning in 1975. Burnett currently serves as president of the Jackson County, Missouri legislature and is a partner in SGB Communications, Inc. Both of our other guests joined Scott this afternoon in our weekly not-for-credit study group on the first 100 days of the Obama presidency, which meets every Tuesday at 4. Also joining us is Tim Kraft, a key field manager for Carter's presidential campaigns, including the pivotal Iowa caucuses. After President Carter's inauguration, Kraft assumed the role of appointments secretary, which is a far more important office than its title might suggest. Basically, its gateway to the leader of the free world. In 1978, Kraft was named an assistant to the president for personnel and political coordination and served in this capacity until he resigned to help with Carter's re-election campaign in 1980. After working as a political consultant, a professor of Latin American studies, and an op-ed writer, Kraft retired to Las Cruces, New Mexico, where he lives with his wife Molly, who is also our guest tonight. Finally, we have Jody Powell, one of the most familiar faces from the Carter administration. He served as press secretary from the moment Governor Carter took the oath of office and served in Georgia, and served in that capacity until the end of President Carter's term. Along with Chief of Staff Hamilton Jordan, Powell was one of the president's most trusted advisors, a Georgia native with 3 political science degrees, 1 from Georgia State and 2 from Emory University. Powell is the author of a memoir entitled The Other Side of the Story and numerous syndicated columns. He's been a frequent guest on television talk shows like This Week with David Brinkley, Nightline, and Good Morning America. Powell held the Tip O'Neill Chair in American Politics at Boston College in 1985-1986, where he taught a course on the press and the presidency. He's one of the founders of the PR firm Powell Tate and lives with his wife in Cambridge, Maryland, on the beautiful Choptank River. Please join me in welcoming Scott Burnett, Tim Kraft, and Jody Powell. Mic's on?
Yep.
Well, welcome to the Dole Institute. Let's start with a few words about a person who really should, and I think we all wished was here tonight, Hamilton Jordan, who died this past May. It was his extraordinary plan presented to Governor Carter well before the campaign that pretty much outlined how a Georgia governor could capture the nomination of the Democratic Party and eventually the nation's highest office. One, what was in that plan, if you can remember it, and two, how did a 30-year-old guy with little or no national political experience draft it?
Defer to Jody.
Mr. Powell.
Well, I mean, I think the thing to remember about the plan is that it was a way that it could happen. It wasn't, this is the way to make sure it happens. But there was a way from here to there. And I think we all understood that there were a whole bunch of things that might happen over which we had absolutely no control that might make that impossible. But you can't do anything about the things you can't do anything about. And so the approach was, okay, there's a way, there's a road, there's a way. Here's the way to optimize the odds here. And it had a lot to do with Iowa and New Hampshire, because those were 2 states that were small enough that a relatively unknown candidate could make himself known. A candidate without a great deal of financial resources could still run a credible campaign there. And we thought that there was a lot about Iowa and New Hampshire and the voters there that would find a candidate like Jimmy Carter with small town roots and sort of traditional values and very much a moderate within the spectrum of Democratic Party politics, attractive, which proved to be the case.
Yeah.
And actually, Hamilton had spent a couple years in Washington working on the National Congressional Campaign Committee. So he'd had a chance to go some places and see people. He and I both traveled around. In fact, I was just running into somebody there that we had been in a campaign in southwestern Missouri in '74. And then after we did that one, we went across to Arkansas, to northwestern Arkansas. And there was a candidate there and running for Congress, and we put in a staff meeting, and this kid comes in that we thought was delivering the pizza, and then they introduced Bill Clinton, who was running unsuccessfully for Congress, I might say.
Yeah.
And a few Democrats were unsuccessful in '74, as a matter of fact.
That's wild. By way of introduction, self-introduction, if you could each tell me a little bit about what your role was on that first campaign. Obviously at 3 very different levels, but I think it'll help set the parameters here.
Well, I think Jimmy Carter was lucky because he had the 2 of us to carry out Hamilton's plan.
That's it.
Isn't
That's
that
it. That's
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
When did he sign up?
I don't know.
No. It's, the governor, in his campaigning for other Democratic candidates, tried to organize meetings after an event. And I think he did this across the country with people that, by political contacts.
Hold on.
It's on.
Yeah, but you got to get it higher up here. You're all bound up here.
Wouldn't want any of this to be lost to history.
That's right.
Somebody once said, I used to have an engineer that traveled around with me that knew how to do all this, but then he got elected president, and so.
That's right. Well, I think in my case, it was representative of a lot of cases, as Governor Carter and Jody Powell traveled around the country in '74 and '75. And as Jody mentioned, Hamilton had worked with the Democratic National Committee, and he wasn't up there just to have a good time in Washington, which he did, but he also was looking for names and making contacts. And at the end of one such fundraiser in Albuquerque, New Mexico, about 10 of us got together after the banquet and listened to Governor Carter talk about what he intended to do in 1975. And he was not going to test the waters. He was not going to see how it worked out. He was not going to form an exploratory committee. He was going to announce for the presidency in 1975, and he was going to enter every primary and caucus, and he was going to work hard, and he did not intend to lose. Those were his words. Well, that struck a chord with a lot of people, I think. That plus his just obvious intelligence and dedication to the issues that a lot of us hope the Democratic Party could promulgate. So that roped me in. It certainly roped in another young man from New Mexico by the name of Chris Brown, and we ended up performing various roles, but eventually we would be campaign coordinators in the state of Iowa and in the state of New Hampshire. And in moving throughout the Midwest and the western states, in early 1975, I would meet people like Scott Burnett and Dennis Tapsack and a number of other people who had already heard Governor Carter speak, or they knew of him through friends, and the movement kept growing in terms of people that wanted to help him out.
Yeah, I met Jimmy Carter in Topeka at the annual Democratic dinner on March 29th, 1975. Jimmy and Rosalind and this guy Jody Powell. And about 3 weeks later, we had the State Young Democrats Convention, and this guy shows up. A bunch of, I remember that Scoop Jackson, Henry Jackson, had an organizer come in from Denver. Tim Kraft came in for Carter, and boy, you're lucky you got me.
Yeah,
that's true. I could have put Scoop Jackson in the presidency.
Well, I wasn't the candidate.
But I started, my friend Dennis Tapsack and I were running buddies, and we started volunteering on the weekends to go with Jimmy Carter if he was going to be in Kansas or Missouri or Nebraska. And Tim came in occasionally. We talked a lot by phone, and I thought Carter had the right message and the intelligence, and I really was lucky to be with him.
If you permit a small aside about that,
Sure.
that 74 campaign, that on election night, Governor Carter spent all night making calls to candidates. The people he called were all the candidates that lost, because those are the ones that nobody was going to call and who would appreciate getting a call. And I'd love to know the percentage of those folks that ended up being early supporters, but I guarantee there's a bunch of them.
That's great. So there was a new system in place, new nominating system in 1976 that actually did make the caucuses in Iowa and that early New Hampshire primary even more important than in the past. How did the Carter campaign kind of seize that opportunity? We've already heard Jody talk a little bit about how there was an idea that Carter's style and politics might resonate there.
Well, those were the first two contests.
Yeah.
And I think that Hamilton Jordan, I always think in terms of Governor Carter and Jody Powell and Hamilton Jordan. It's hard to distinguish between the contributions of the three. They put their heads together and decided that they were going to go all out in Iowa and New Hampshire. And I remember reading a Gary Hart book about the McGovern campaign in Iowa.
Right.
And they thought that Iowa was important. Not that many people in the National Press Corps picked that up, but Gary Hart wrote a book called Right from the Start. And he talked about the efforts that they made in Iowa with a young organizer from Wisconsin by the name of Gene Picorni, and that the caucuses allowed McGovern's type of appeal and his anti-war stance and his hard work in grassroots organizing to pay off. Well, excuse me, Muskie won the Iowa caucuses, but McGovern came surprisingly close. And I'll never forget this part of Gary Hart's book. He said that the morning after the Iowa caucuses, Bill Lawrence, who was a national political correspondent for ABC News, said that Senator Muskie's presidential campaign ran off an icy road in Iowa last night.
Right.
And Hart said that we would have paid $2 million for that sentence.
But in 1968, how was the national delegates selected? I don't know that. McGovern was the first time there was caucuses were important. Was it party bosses in 68, 64?
Not so much in Iowa. But you have to remember, when you go back to 1960, John Kennedy ran in all of 6 primaries.
That's it.
6 primaries. And the rest of the delegate selection was done by the state party apparati.
Right.
And for the most part, state chairman and as you say, bosses. Governor Carter used to call them leaders if they're with me, bosses if they're against me.
Well, I mean, the short answer is that by 76, the nominating process was much more small d democratic and
Right.
much more proportional representation, much more powerful voice from individuals as opposed to the political leadership in the states.
Yeah, and those reforms that the young campaigners came out of 72 with were actually implemented. So
Right.
That's right.
Yeah, so these
That's
delegates
right.
were apportioned. Who were the three of you most concerned about among the other Democratic candidates? From an outsider like me, it seems like the strategy was to eliminate major rivals one by one, and I looked this up. George Wallace in North Carolina, Scoop Jackson in Pennsylvania, Mo Udall in Wisconsin, and then Jerry Brown kind of comes on in the end. Was this the strategy, and who were you most concerned about on the Democratic side?
Well, I don't know. I defer to Jody on that in terms of a national strategic level. It seemed to me we just took it state by state.
Okay,
And,
one day at a time.
Yeah, one day at a time. And in Iowa, Mo Udall was very popular there. I mean, his political stance and his political demeanor and personality lent itself to good support in Iowa. What he did, however, was he chose two sort of distinctly factionalized people as leaders of his campaign in Iowa. And so people sort of identified him with the very liberal wing of the Democratic Party.
Okay.
And Governor Carter, in choosing an outsider who just looked for help from all sides of the political spectrum, in this case myself, we were able to assemble a steering committee that represented a broader base than Udall was able to achieve. Scoop Jackson didn't even compete in Iowa. Birch Bayh came in October or November.
Way too late.
Yeah, was sort of a, I'm Senator Bayh, and you're lucky to have me. And anyway.
That goes over great in Des Moines.
Yeah.
I always thought, I agree with, to the extent it was, we're going to be everywhere, so
Right.
we had to take on whoever showed up that night. But that, in my view, there was, in terms of the nomination itself, probably Mo Udall was the most serious challenge. But we clearly had to beat George Wallace somewhere, and it was really Florida that did that. And then North Carolina was a sort of coup de grace. But it was and at the same time in Florida, I mean, the place that Scoop had to make a real play was in Florida too, and it was expected to do well. So Florida really went a long way toward, I think it pretty well didn't do Scoop because he tried it again in Pennsylvania, but he was seriously crippled after that. And Wallace took a lot of steam out of Wallace to win, for Carter to win in Florida, because Wallace had run there 4 years before. So and then it really did become, as you say, Wallace was the only challenge in North Carolina. Scoop was a big challenge in Pennsylvania.
There was talk about Humphrey getting in Pennsylvania, but he didn't.
Right, and then Super Tuesday was the sort of anybody but Carter crowd of ne'er-do-wells.
Scott, how about from your perspective? You were a young college kid.
Pay grade's way above mine.
Well, I know, but who else had kind of entered your consciousness as the future leader of the party?
Well, I didn't really focus on it much. I worked here.
Yeah.
And I then worked I was able to allow Frank Church to beat Jimmy Carter in Nebraska.
Yeah.
So that we had some struggles near the end. We lost to Jerry Brown in California. We lost to Frank Church in Idaho and in Nebraska. So it seemed like it got hard there at the end. But I remember early May, Carter was on the front of Time magazine, but I don't remember any specific person in my mind.
Okay. Here's something to think about. Maybe it doesn't seem that extraordinary, but in American history, no president from the Deep South had been elected president since Zachary Taylor in 1848. That's a long time. That's over 100 years. Was this a factor in either Governor Carter's thinking or any of your thinking, that it's just not going to happen to have someone from the South, a governor from the South, be president?
I think it factored into a lot of Massachusetts thinking. But I mean, that wasn't a consideration for me. I just, the people in Iowa and New Hampshire that listened to him and got to know his family and got to know. Maybe
it's the equivalent of will white people vote for a black candidate like Barack Obama? Maybe it was one of the things that people talked about and then it didn't end up being a deal.
I thought it was going to be a problem, a challenge.
I did too.
In some areas more than others. And I won't tell that.
Please.
The Joe Rouse.
But I also thought that once Carter became a viable candidate, that we would also end up with a pretty solid South supporting him.
Okay.
So on the whole, I thought it was probably a more of an asset than not.
Okay.
And it because if we couldn't become viable, it sort of didn't really matter, did it?
It would have been over.
If we couldn't get off to a decent start in Iowa and New Hampshire, enough of a decent start so that our fellow Southerners could say, "All right, look, he's our guy. Let's go with him." Then, hey, it's over. But if we did that, then I thought we would, and that proved to be very much the case throughout the not only the Deep South but the border South too. And plus, you have to remember that one of the things that was hugely important there was that you had black politicians from Georgia who were also nationally known, like Andy Young, who were with Carter early and were out campaigning for him, and I don't know how a good portion of the black leadership in this country at that time had gone to school in Atlanta because of the Atlanta University complex of Morris Brown and Atlanta University and all that. So the Atlanta and Georgia had been home to large numbers of black political leaders and professional leaders and community leaders from Detroit, sort of all to California, all across the country, and they knew people like Andy, and so that was a tremendous asset too, and particularly when there was a danger of him being depicted as because he's from the small town, the Deep South, he's a white guy and he's probably a bigot. Then having
Absolutely.
people like Andrew Young and Coretta Scott King and others stand up and say, "I know this man, and that's not right."
Merrick Coleman Young in Detroit.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and he was a New South governor, and he had not voted against integration, and I think he'd appointed a very large amount of African Americans to his administration as governor as well. So
relatively speaking, but then the bar wasn't so high.
Yeah, good point. If you had appointed
But
any...
it wasn't probably terribly high in Kansas either, so...
No kidding. Before we get to the Republican side, which I'm interested to hear what you guys think, how much of when you were out there on the trail, when you were talking to voters in these various states, were Watergate and the pardon of Richard Nixon the issues that people wanted to talk about? Or had people moved on from that and they wanted to know what Jimmy Carter would do for the country?
I mean, Watergate was very much on their mind. Mm-hmm. People wanted change. They were tired of things as they had been. We'd been through a very troubling time, just as I think many Americans felt we've just been through, and that was a lot of what was on their mind. Is they wanted significant change.
He had a basic stump speech that appealed to the best in the country. Now that's how he ended every speech. God knows we heard it 5,000 times, but he delivered
Not as much as I did.
sincerely and effectively, and it certainly resonated well with Iowa.
Is this the one that ended, the President of the United States should be as good as the people of the United States?
Yeah.
Which I think actually...
The government,
yeah, which is, I think, really a point right to Watergate.
Yeah.
It really was so much bigger and broader and deeper and more complicated and all than Watergate, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, the country had just been through a lot. And yeah, I mean, people didn't like Nixon, but you know what? There's a good part of the Democratic Party they didn't like either. Mm-hmm. They didn't like flags being burned and soldiers being spat upon and all that. And I mean, that was a real culture war. And I think what people wanted was to move past that, and they wanted somebody who was not a part of all that. And either line of battle, if you will. I used to say, I'm not kin to anybody. I don't know anybody that was at Columbia or even at Kent State, but I know a hell of a lot of guys that went to Vietnam and some that didn't come back. Right. And I'm kin to some of those folks. And I always said that I, in that sense, was a lot more like most of America than the opposite, and that, you know, there was a desire sort of for healing, and you know, and to your point about Nixon and the pardon, you know, Carter, which, or you may not know, but Jimmy Carter agreed with the pardon of Nixon.
Okay.
Because he thought, and he promised publicly and said, I remember we were in New Hampshire, and he said, I am not going to criticize President Ford for that. Mm-hmm. And he didn't. Mm-hmm. All the way through, not in the primaries, and not even in the general in the general election. I think that's the sort of thing, small as it may have seemed, but that people said, yeah, you know, that's kind of right. I don't like it either, but which they didn't. The vast majority didn't, but
he wasn't. You know, he didn't have to run against Nixon.
Right.
He almost didn't have to run against Ford. He had to get out there and enunciate a positive vision of what he wanted to do, and then stick around and answer questions for anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour and a half, yeah. Which he did.
But he wasn't Nixon, that's right. Yeah. But Birch Bayh wasn't Nixon, and Mo Udall wasn't Nixon, and or Milton Schaap, or even Sam Jordan. Sam almost was. Could have been.
That's really good.
But I don't think, with all due respect to those, to most of them, certainly to Birch and to Mo, you know, I don't think they could have won that election in '76.
Well,
so in that sense, what you say about not being Nixon and not having to run against Nixon is right. But there had to be something else that, you know, that
he had a speech that was not Washingtonese.
Yeah,
it was different.
Well, plus, he was about the hardest working person in the world, still is.
Yeah.
He'll be 85 October the 1st. But he was on the road 250 days in 1975, I believe is the figure.
Wow. Yeah. Oh, I mean, obviously, incumbency is a huge advantage in American politics. That's the way the rules are written.
Depends.
But, yeah, and that's the next part of my question. Did you guys? I know you were going day to day, and you're just trying to survive as a viable candidacy. But did you guys look at President Ford in 1975, early '76, and say this guy's the incumbent, but he is as vulnerable as an incumbent has ever been, or did he look like a tough race?
What do you think?
I think we started worrying about Gerald Ford later than we should have. On the other hand, we really didn't have the nomination locked up until Super Tuesday, and so we couldn't afford to worry about Ford too much. We still had problems within our own party, which thanks, I think, to a great extent to Morris Udall. You know, the convention was a huge success and a unifying factor. I'm not sure we ever. I think the problem with Ford was that I'm not sure we thought we did, and we told ourselves we did, but I'm not sure we ever really fully understood deeply enough amongst ourselves how we were going to run against this guy, or for the presidency. Yeah, you know, as it all to this guy, and as a result, we got kind of pushed and pulled in the general election campaign.
Without getting to that too quickly, did you ever talk about Ronald Reagan
in '76
before the convention? Yeah.
No, not that I recall.
In the sense that we didn't ever really talk about too much about. I was sort of glad to have him in there because it made life difficult for Ford, but then I got to think, God, he might win, though. That might be a problem.
Okay, so at least that thought entered your mind, even if it didn't become the stuff of campaign strategy.
Though I think Reagan's lucky he did win in '76. I think he actually would not have run as well as Ford did, probably in '76.
That's always the way I've thought of it. But then you must have all watched that Republican convention at Kemp Arena in Kansas City very closely. It is, I'm trying to think if there's another, but I don't think there is, the last convention in American history that started and you didn't know who the nominee was going to be. That just doesn't happen anymore, which is why those conventions are often painful to watch. Were you pulling for one side or another there when the convention votes were happening?
I just wanted to keep on talking about it as long as they were willing to let it go.
Yeah.
Well, we always thought Reagan would be pushover in 76 and in in 80.
I didn't think it was going to be a pushover in
Well,
80.
most of us,
Christ.
you know,
Now we know where
how,
the problem was.
how could you support? How could anyone support a guy like Ronald Reagan?
Yeah, right.
Well, you know,
I don't know what kind of folks you people ever elected in Kansas, but
Yeah.
no,
I knew people could vote for people like that.
There you go.
yeah. I
In
think
Kansas, too.
in,
Oh, good.
I think the focus in '76 was, I mean, we just assumed the Republicans would, you know, go with the incumbent. And in 1980, a lot of people in the Democratic Party thought that, you know, the old cliches about Reagan, the actor, et cetera, et cetera. But we counseled with a group of California Democrats in the spring of 1980, and they cautioned us to, you know, take Ronald Reagan lightly at your peril.
Right. Oh, absolutely.
That he is an extraordinary communicator, and he's been elected twice,
Right.
and just don't underestimate that guy. And I don't think we did. But there's just too many other factors at play beyond our control, other than who the Republicans put up.
Yeah. How big a factor? I mean, again, it's hard for me, who really came of political age after this, you know, with a party that was dominated by the conservatives and a party that was dominated by liberals. How much did you and the Carter campaign think about what was happening in the Republican Party, this battle of moderates versus conservatives, and that Jimmy Carter would have to run on that note? Or did it just not happen that way?
Well, the Democratic Party, I heard you ask about the Republican, the Democratic Party was much less dominated by liberals then than it is now. And, you know, you still had a much larger number of Southern Democrats who tended to be moderate to conservatives. So it was a sort of a broader tent than it is today, as a matter of fact. I don't remember thinking, honestly, a lot about the sort of Republican Party and because I must say, looking back on it, I didn't predict how long and how powerfully the right wing would just totally dominate that party.
Related question. 1976, most scholars are now talking about as the first election where evangelical Christians were a big factor in the election. And they were a big factor in favor of Governor Carter. Most evangelicals that year broke strongly for the Democratic candidate. Is that something that you folks in the campaign were aware of, or that Governor Carter played to, or that, or did it just kind of happen and you didn't really pay much attention at the time?
Well, actually, I mean, my impression was that evangelical Christians had been predominantly Democratic up to that point in any case, or if not, they were. It was a very close.
Baptist, Pentecostals, for the most part,
Right.
I think were.
Yeah. I mean, depending on how you define evangelical Christians, I mean,
But, you know, it hadn't been as much of a factor in electoral politics. A lot of evangelicals had kind of stayed out of it.
Well, some of them, yes. Well, but that was more. I mean, it certainly wasn't the case for Southern Baptists,
right,
for example. A lot of it was the case with a number of the smaller denominations and that sort of thing who really did believe that sort of being involved in politics was sort of something that you just didn't do. But Southern Baptists I think were 20 million of them. You know, they ran half the states in the South.
Yeah.
Were very much involved in politics and encouraged to be that way. But yeah, I mean, I think I certainly felt, I knew that that was one of the things that I think made him special.
Right,
was that this was a person whose religious faith was clear, but very seldom didn't talk about it much. I've also said, I bet you, of all our modern presidents of my lifetime, Jimmy Carter read more scripture and quoted it less publicly than any of them.
Very good point. All right, well, the Democratic convention happens. Jimmy Carter commissions a poll, and he's got a 33-point lead over President Ford. Like resounding lead. Did you guys feel pretty good then?
No. Really? Was there any poll that said 33?
That's the one I looked at just now.
It was certainly in the 20s.
Okay.
Yeah.
And may have been.
No, we've never. I don't think anybody in the national campaign felt comfortable with it. A post-convention leading the polls. Those things are that's the most ephemeral and misleading and probably inaccurate poll there ever is.
Yeah.
Because the next party's convention is going to give them a bump.
Right.
And then you get through Labor Day and the American people begin to focus. And the first polls in October are the ones that count.
Yeah, that's probably a good point. The strategy of the Ford White House, which I look back on, and it really does look quite brilliant, and it starts to bring that Ford resurgence, is the famous Rose Garden strategy. He got to be president, have events at the White House, preside over that fantastic bicentennial celebration with all the fireworks. He got to look like a president. How did that affect things?
It was a good strategy. I still think we did as much to ourselves in that general election campaign as anybody did to us. And I'm still not sure exactly what the right balance. But even though we did come out of the convention with a reasonably unified party, we still felt the need, and I think probably accurately so, to reach out to a lot of the constituencies in the party that had not been Carter supporters, constituencies on the left, urban voters in places like New York and that sort of thing, significant portions of labor, although he had some good labor support in the nominating process. And I think the way we did that, it started making us look just like the folks that we just beaten. That he wasn't this new, different sort of person. He was the guy that's running around cuddling up with all the usual suspects, sort of thing. And we never figured out a way to do that without letting it sort of dominate the perceptions. And the Ford people were good at sort of playing that up too, which I would have done the same thing if I.
And we had to, almost overnight, to expand the campaign organization geometrically. And to find people that could help us in New York and New Jersey and deal with ethnic urban voters and constituencies that we'd either lost or had not done that well with in the primaries. But
because we'd not run well in New York, hadn't run well in California.
Yeah. But I think the Carter campaign assembled a good team we sort of adopted the 1960 Kennedy model, wherein you do not pick somebody within the state. You pick a professional campaign manager that can deal with all the factions within that state. And so you're not factioned out, as it were. And that person will help you carry the state, come hell or high water. There may be blood on the floor, but they'll help you carry the state, and then they're gone. And frankly, that's a good model. Well, as long as there's not too much blood.
Well, you definitely see people following that same model in the current cycles.
Yeah, yeah.
So basically, Ford, as I look at the narrative, the Ford campaign is doing well. They're starting to hit their stride. They've got those appearances with Joe Garagiola, the old St. Louis Cardinal, that are, kind of appealing, I suppose. It shows that the president's kind of a regular guy. Then the debates come up. All right, the first debate, again, you were there, I wasn't. I mean, it seems like Ford did pretty well in that first debate, and it was a hard one for you. Is that how you'd remember it?
Not exactly. He won it, but Carter. I always said that the main thing a challenger has to do in a debate, in a first debate, is you have to sort of get over the bar. You've got to reach a point where a significant majority of the voters can sort of see you as a president. That you gotta, even if you lose, which we did sort of narrowly in that debate, but clearly Carter had passed that presidential bar. So I felt pretty good about
mission accomplished after
about that debate. Yeah,
that's important. And then there's the gaffe, the one that really just stops whatever momentum Ford has going in its tracks. When
I thought you were going to talk about ours.
Well, tell me about you. I don't remember any such thing.
You don't remember lusting in
the Playboy Interview. Okay, let's talk about the Playboy Interview. First of all, whose idea was it to do the interview
Mine.
with Playboy? What were you thinking?
I've often asked myself that.
A new constituency.
Yeah, I thought we needed help with the Playmate vote.
Wasn't that earlier? Was that in the fall?
No, that was in.
That was in general election campaign.
Yeah, but it was right after the convention.
Yeah. It was actually before the first debate.
Okay. So I'm getting knocked out of chronology.
But that
it was in August.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it was.
I think it was the September issue, and it came out in August.
And did that feel like a gaffe when that hit the stands?
Oh yeah, I mean.
Oh yeah.
Although when you look back on it,
it's so tame.
And you think about all we have seen.
I know.
The fact that a guy gets trashed for lusting in his heart, for God's sake. I mean, come on. I mean,
it does seem a little bit quaint.
But it went to one of the things the Ford people sort of did, I thought, was to make Carter appear, Southern Baptist, farmer, small town, South, maybe a little strange, and that sort of King James version biblical use of the language, I think, played into that sort of thing.
Good point.
Into that sort of thing.
That's how those things can be effective when they play into a larger narrative.
we should have greeted it with a burst of laughter and moved on, I guess.
Yeah. I remember the word. They tried to create sort of a weirdness factor.
Yeah.
This guy's hard to understand. What's he really all about?
All right. Well, I wasn't even talking about that, but it's the Ford gaffe that I want to talk about. When on national TV in front of everybody, he says that the Soviet Union does not dominate Eastern Europe and
Poland,
and Poles wouldn't want to hear that they're dominated by the Soviet Union. What was that like within the campaign?
I can't remember when the first bump in the poll came. It was probably within 72 hours.
I couldn't believe he'd said it.
Yeah.
And then, and I sort of stopped myself and said, "Did he just say that?"
Yeah.
And then, who was it? One of the panelists actually tried to toss him.
Yeah, a lifeline.
And said, "Now, was that what you meant to say?" And I'm thinking, "Shut up! This is not your job. You're supposed to pounce. You're not supposed to. You're not supposed to go pat him on the back and see if he'll spit the bone up. I mean."
Yeah.
But bless his heart, he stuck with it. And
for like a week.
Yeah, and
he wouldn't retract it.
And I don't think the substance of it cost him that much, but I think that he lost 3 days of
important days.
Yeah, that you just. I mean, I always said the general election campaign is sort of like 40 days and 40 nights of the deluge, and then it's over. And if you lose one or two of those, you've lost a lot.
And do you have the date of when that is?
I should have gotten a chronology printed out, but I don't think I do have one. But it was close to the election.
It was 2
weeks out.
2 weeks out, 2 to 3, I think.
I should have gotten a chronology. And then just as far before we open it up to questions from the audience, from you. The results are interesting, and I tried to put some of them into historical perspective. Jimmy Carter was the first Democrat since JFK to carry the states of the Deep South, and you certainly don't see that happening for Democrats right now.
Nope.
10 states
in
the Deep South.
10 states in the Deep South. Jimmy Carter got 50.1% of the total vote, the only majority that any Democrat has won since 1944, Franklin Roosevelt, until last November. When Barack Obama got 53% of the vote. So did it feel, was that I hope that you felt very, very good after the results came in, after that rough fall.
Well, yeah. And there's a group called the, oh, come on, what's Al Fromm's group called? The
DLC?
Yeah, the DLC.
Yeah.
They had a couple of analysts do an in-depth look at the 76 returns. And I wish I'd have kept that book. I gave it to somebody, but it was really impressive in terms of Carter bringing back the white male vote and doing very well with African American votes.
Okay.
I mean, just, it's not one or the other. You're not out of sync. It's an across-the-board broadening appeal of both candidate Carter and the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
And which we lost ground on in 1980.
Oh yeah, big time. The title of the program, last question I'll ask, is that, it's the spirit of 76, why the presidential campaign that year is a classic. Why for you, the three of you, is it such a memorable campaign? Is it such an important campaign in 20th century American history?
Well, go first. It was Hamilton Jordan put it very succinctly. He said we outsmarted them and we outworked them. And that can't happen anymore. You have to factor in the almighty dollar and the countless hours and the stratagems to bundle and,
So was money not a constant factor for you guys?
Well, it was a constant factor, but if it had been the factor, we wouldn't have won, right?
Okay.
I'll give you a very small sort of example of that. That there were like 4 weeks between the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primaries. So that meant that if you did well in Iowa, you actually had time to translate that success and momentum into real bucks.
Right.
So you can run in Iowa, and then a week or two later in Florida. Now, it's like a week or whatever. I mean, there's just no time for that. So, yeah, I mean, it was hugely important for us. In fact, 1975, I think we were, Hamilton and I and maybe Frank were
Moore.
Were the three highest paid people in the campaign. We were making $24,000 a year. And we decided, because we loved Tim Kraft so much, that we would all give up our salaries for the last 3 months of the year so we could, and sort of that
On my wild
$20,000 was real money, so we could give it to Kraft to spend in Iowa. And we did.
I spent at least half of it on the campaign.
Yeah. I believe it.
I joined the campaign on paid staff February of '76, and I went from $1,000 a month in Martha Key's congressional office. Hamilton said, "We can pay you $400."
Oh, $100 a week.
$400 a month.
Right.
$400 a month.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, when remember the hullabaloo about the Clinton campaign spending, tens of thousands of dollars on luxury suites for their staff and buying dinners, catered dinners. I had a call from, I think Jody gave her my number because she hadn't heard from me for 20 years. But Eleanor Clift of Newsweek called and said, when you were in Iowa, did you buy a lot of dinners to get those people to those straw polls? I said, are you kidding? The staff didn't have the money to go to the dinners.
Yeah.
We had a lot of good Iowans and good volunteers that showed up, and then we may have sneaked a few onto the main floor for the vote, but we didn't buy anybody dinner. Anyway, that's...
So is it an important campaign? If Gerald Ford had hung on to win, would that have changed things much, or what should we take away?
Well, to answer that, which we don't want to, I mean, you almost got to sort of look at what happened during the administration and then what happened after.
After, okay.
And in some ways, I mean, it's significant for the things we said of it's a guy coming from nowhere without a lot of money.
Uh-huh.
And all that. But that can't happen again now.
Yeah.
So it was a moment in time. I also think, and I hate to put this in terms of sort of chances gone or glimmering, but I think it was the last chance for the Democratic Party to actually maintain a broader coalition and
Geographic,
but it's in a way sort of Southern Democrats become a sort of stand-in for more moderate blue-collar Democrats elsewhere in the country too, in that regard, because we lost both of them,
yep,
or a significant portion of them at the same time, and but that didn't happen either, and I think maybe there's another chance at that.
Yeah.
But it won't be easy. It won't be easy, and
Well, the other, what ifs would include, would President Ford have concluded a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel?
Right. No.
Would we have problems in Central and South America? The energy problem is, that got evaporated anyway. Mm-hmm. But President Carter did do certain things
Absolutely.
in an international stage that are still with us today.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Anything else before I open it up? I think Peter has a handheld mic, so if you have a question for any of these gentlemen, please raise your hand. He'll find you. One in the corner here.
Well, as an aside, he must have had some money in the fall of 1975 because I was at a football game here, homecoming, and there was a plane flying over Little Piper Cub, and behind it was a sign that said Jimmy Carter. I turned around and said, "Who's Jimmy Carter?" And the guy said, "Oh, I think he's singing country western over."
yeah, he wrote "You Are My Sunshine." You remember that?
Yeah.
Well, you know what
My question is, since we're at the Robert J. Dole Institute of Politics,
I left this out.
what influence, one way or the other, do you think the Dole serving as the vice presidential candidate had an effect on the 1976 election?
Well, first, let me. I'll take the part about the airplane. I don't think that mic was working.
Yeah.
But, the question was, you must have had some money in the fall of '75 because there was an airplane over a football game here that said Jimmy Carter. There was Tim had, as I'd said, Jody and President Mrs. Carter had been here. Tim had been here a lot, and then in Topeka there was a man named Bob Brock. And Bob, many of you know him. He was a big contributor to the University of Kansas. Beg pardon? Yeah, he owned a bunch of Holiday Inns. Well, he was for Lloyd Benson, if I remember.
Well, I think he gave a little to everybody.
But his wife, Louise Brock, was big for Jimmy Carter, and I'll bet she paid for that plane. I bet you she did, because she was a devout Jimmy Carter supporter, and I bet that's how that happened that day.
That's very good, because I was going to ask you what the hell you were doing hiring a damn airplane in
Kansas.
The fall of 1975 in Kansas.
It was Kraft.
First time I heard of it.
I guarantee you Jimmy Carter's itching right now.
Yeah.
But I didn't ask about the vice presidential campaign. Obviously, Dole replacing Nelson Rockefeller might have had an effect. Also, the debate where he, I think Senator Dole has told me in conversation that he wishes he hadn't said what he said about all the wars of the 20th century being Democrat wars. I think that's the quote.
Yeah.
Did that have any effect on the campaign?
Yeah, I think it's one of the few. It's one of the few times, maybe the only time ever, that a vice presidential debate has actually had an impact on a campaign. An interesting sidelight to that I just happened to be with Governor Carter then at that night with some other folks watching the vice presidential debate, and when it was over, he asked me to get Senator Mondale on the phone, and I did, but I actually ended up with him on the phone with me before I could get it to, and it was clear that Senator Mondale thought he had lost. he felt terrible about it, and I said, Senator, oh my God, that was magnificent. You really handled yourself so well, and that. He said, you really think so? I was just, I might say that he thought, but he was very uncertain about how that was going to play, and he had had to sit there and take it, getting pounded on for that length of time, and he was very unsure about how it seemed. Yeah, exactly. But that was, and in a way, I certainly didn't feel sorry for Senator Dole at the time, but in a way, I mean, he has such a quick wit and such a great wry sense of humor, and of course none of that came across in that debate. And it wasn't just that line. He just came across as being very, very sort of harsh and not very appealing to people. I think, but it did move the numbers somewhat.
Interesting. Great question. David Ambler up here in the front.
Would you speak to the attitude of the Democratic establishment, particularly along the eastern seaboard, towards Jimmy Carter and his campaign, both before the convention and then during the presidential campaign itself?
Tactfully?
Well, one of the things about being an outsider is that generally that means the establishment's not for you, right? Mm-hmm. And it may not be that they particularly dislike you, but they don't think you got a chance to win, and so they don't like to support people that aren't going to be winners and all that. I thought the party on the whole certainly came together much better in 1976 after the convention than in 1980. But that had everything to do with the attitude of the other candidate, and beginning with but not just Morris Udall, but everybody, Morris Udall, Birch Bayh, George Wallace, the whole bunch of them, for the most part, really very publicly supported Carter after the convention, which was not the case in 1980 at all. So,
and we had our bumps and bruises with Northeast politics, ethnic politics, that we admittedly lacked some skill with, or skills in, or representation with, connections with. And that took some learning. But we had some good help along the way. I think we developed a pretty good campaign staff in that respect to help us sort of sort these things out. But it was not easy. And there was a certain faction in the ADA, which I know Governor Carter will remember, President Carter will remember, and Jody probably will too, that would, to this day, would have voted for anybody but Carter.
Yeah.
There's an amazing fellow we talked about earlier tonight named Paul Sullivan, who ran Illinois. And he had to deal with Mayor Daley. And Paul's from Buffalo.
Originally?
I think. He lives in Hawaii now, but he was our state coordinator in Illinois in 1976. And I'd love to get him here sometime. The stories that he has to tell about Mayor Daley, and that was the difference in that campaign. Yeah. Illinois. Paul's just got talks about, they said, well, you can have 20 minutes with the mayor, and he went in there and started like Paul Sullivan is, a storyteller, an Irish storyteller, and he spent 3 hours with Mayor Daley, and they got along very, very well, and that was one of the differences of '76.
Well, the other thing is you get these diamonds in a rough. We got a reformed alcoholic, excommunicated New Jersey state chairman, and we asked him to run Ohio for us, and we won Ohio by 1976 by hook or by crook, I suppose you'd say. But sometimes these the people you pick up along the way are just incredibly helpful in terms of wanting to see a Democratic president. Remember Dan Horgan?
Yeah.
Great question. Anybody else?
Seems to me that generally when you hear talk about President Carter, it's about what a great former president he is. Has that overshadowed his presidency and caused us to forget that there were some significant things done during his administration?
I think we were talking about that earlier today, and I think it has to a significant degree. And the other thing that has contributed to, or one of the other things that contributed to him not getting the sort of credit I think he deserves for what he accomplished as a president, is that the country never really got a chance to enjoy the benefits fully of a lot of what he did, because so much of it was either undone within 2 or 3 years after he left office, which was certainly the case with energy. And I said this to the folks this afternoon. I guarantee you, when Barack Obama proposes his energy plan, and you look at it, almost every single thing in it was done by 1981. Not in every specific, but all the major categories of things on alternative fuels and all of that was done. It was in place. It was off and going, and it was also gone within less than two or 3 years. And to a great extent, the same thing's true of the Middle East. That we still enjoy the benefits, and so does the Middle East, and so do the Israelis of that peace treaty with Egypt, because it prevented another major Arab-Israeli war. But the momentum and the opportunity to move beyond that into a broader settlement, basically no president other than George Bush Sr. has had the guts to pick it up and really push hard for it and get anything done. And did I say that? It's a huge tragedy, and that is so much harder to do anything about now. I mean, it's just hugely more complicated.
These things all get harder to solve, not easier.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Settlement by settlement,
Yeah.
as it were.
Maybe time for 1 or 2 more questions. Ed, quick, up here. Oh, we'll get to Ed in a second.
Yeah, I'd like to change the focus a little and ask a question about the hostage situation. When the decision was made to attempt that, was it pretty much unanimous? And maybe in terms of probabilities, what kind of chance did you think you had of pulling it off?
This is the rescue operation to free the hostages in Iran?
Yeah, I don't think, anybody gave us, or did the president or anybody else ask the military to give us, a percentage chance on the thing. That it was clear that they wouldn't have suggested it if they didn't think there was a high chance of success. And I have to say, I think, and as I sat through almost every bit of that, I think if they had gotten to the gates of the embassy, or even to their second stopping point, their overnight point, I think it would have been a success, because clearly from everything we know since then, the Iranians in the embassy were not expecting anything like that, and they were totally unprepared for it. And I think it probably would have been successful. In retrospect, well, you've probably read a lot of the stuff, the post-mortems on it, and that sort of thing. That we really didn't have a dedicated capability to do that sort of thing, and so you put it together, involving 3 services, and sometimes you had people doing things that had been better off if somebody else did, and vice versa. But I was for it, and I think everybody else that I know of thought we ought to make the effort, except for Secretary Vance, of course, and he eventually resigned because he thought it was not something that we should have tried.
Ed Quick had a question up here near the front. Jody, I think that's the day of the administration that I remember most hearing from you is the day after that, or the day of that. Must have been a not great day on the job.
Not a great day.
I agree that President Carter did a lot of good things that he didn't get credit for, and there were a lot of things that happened that he had no control over during his administration. But there were a lot of friends of his who also thought that could have done better on some things, and one of the problems people thought was that there was no adult that could tell him when he was wrong, except for Burt Lance. And when Burt Lance went, that was a real problem. I like to know your opinion of that. Also, I think another thing that happened, as I recall, that he had established a good relationship with Hubert Humphrey, that Hubert Humphrey died in '77, and that if he had had Hubert Humphrey to help him with the Congress, would have been helpful. But the business of, I know that you and Hamilton Jordan and could talk to him about things, but the impression was that his self-confidence was such that his judgments were so good that nobody could dissuade him from them except for Burt Lance. And I don't know whether that's true or not, but that's what the impression was. And when Burt Lance had to go, there was nobody that could tell him when he was wrong.
I certainly agree about Humphrey, and I've often said that myself, that it would have made a tremendous difference that he, while he lived, he just went the second mile over and over again to try to help the new president and that. I think Carter missed Burt, but not for the same reason. I think Burt was kind of an easygoing, easy to talk to sort of guy, and that's forth. But Carter was probably the easiest person I know to, and is open to argument and to strong dissent. I mean, quite the opposite of what the sort of normal image of politicians. Now, you could usually tell when he didn't like it, and you could, after a while, if you look real close, you could tell when you'd said about as much as could be said on that subject. But he was very, very open to
I could
people that to being challenged, to being questioned, to being argued with. Now, the thing that he did, and maybe this is what you're talking about, and I just have it a little bit different. One of the things that he fairly constantly rejected advice was people that wanted him to sort of go a little slower, not push things quite as hard, not try to do so much, and sort of not, and he just refused to do that. He just felt like there were things that needed to be done. And I said to the folks this afternoon, there was a time when I thought that was a mistake, and even said so several times. As the years have gone by and I've looked back on it, I'm really convinced the other way now, that if he hadn't done that, if he hadn't pushed so much, so hard, he would have gotten a lot less done. Now, he would have probably gotten more credit for it, but he was asking people to do some really tough things, and the Congress didn't like it, and you can't really blame them. But they would not have done more of that if he'd asked them to do less. Right. They would have done less, and probably a lot more less. And we're going to see. It's going to be interesting. I'm interested now to watch the last day or so. The usual yappy dogs starting in on President Obama about the same thing. Well, he's asking the Congress to do too much, and I'm saying they don't work but 3 damn days a week. For God's sake, they make good money. Saddle up, guys. We got work to do here. But he's got, and of course, poor President Obama, he's got bigger problems we ever thought about having.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let me add something to that. I mean, I was privy to a lot of these meetings just as appointment secretary. And there were people around him who were not easily browbeaten by a stern, gaze or a sharp word. I mean, people like James Schlesinger,
Big.
Big Brzezinski. I mean, I had arguments just in terms of arguing with Brzezinski in front of the president over why Brzezinski should get an hour and a half for the deputy agricultural minister of Afghanistan or something. And he wanted all the time in the world. And Hamilton and Jody would take their strongest arguments to him in either a political or media sense, and they wouldn't hesitate to make those arguments. It's not like, but if Carter had the goods, or if he had a course that he wanted to pursue, then he's the president, and you say, at some point you just say, so be it. But I think that's a specious argument that he was surrounded by yes people. It just wasn't the case.
I always knew that the discussion was over when he would say, well, Jody, if you want to make that decision, why don't you run for president?
Final word, Scott?
Well, I've enjoyed it very much. I'm a lot younger than these two. And I really was in the trenches, but what a time. What a time. And I very much want to thank both of you for coming here. This has been
Thanks for inviting us.
Well,
I appreciate it.
And it was an amazing campaign, and I really appreciate you guys' candor and sharing it with us. Thanks a lot for coming, and please help me thank them.